All right, gather round, history nerds and internet dwellers. Today we are talking about the big guy, the rail splitter, the Great Emancipator, the man who arguably had the worst night out at the theater in human history, Abraham Lincoln. Now, when you picture Lincoln, you probably see a stoic marble statue sitting in a chair looking like he's judging your life choices. Or maybe you see the guy on the $5 bill who looks like he just realized he left the oven on. But erase those images. The real Abraham Lincoln was not a boring old politician. He was a terrifying physical specimen, a wrestling god, a master of sarcasm, and a man who suffered from such severe depression that his friends used to hide the knives in his house just in case. He is the ultimate American underdog story, if that underdog was 6'4", ugly as sin, and had a wife who chased him around the kitchen with a butcher knife. He wanted Abe to chop wood and farm. He used to say Abe was stuck on books. So you have this giant teenager who hates farming, loves Shakespeare, and carries an axe. He was basically an emo lumberjack. Eventually, Lincoln strikes out on his own. He builds a flatboat and sails down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. This is where he first sees a slave market. He sees human beings in chains, families being torn apart. He doesn't say much at the time, but he writes later that the image was like a splinter in his mind that never healed. He moves to New Illinois to a town called New Salem. He tries to be a shopkeeper. He fails. He tries to be a general store owner. He fails. His partner dies, leaving Lincoln with a massive debt that he jokingly called the national debt. It took him 15 years to pay it off. He was not a good businessman. He was too honest. If he accidentally overcharged you 6 cents, he would walk 3 miles to your house to give it back. That's bad for profit margins, but great for branding. This is where he gets the nickname Honest Abe. He once said, "God is good to me, for he gave me a wife who drives me into politics." Basically, he ran for office just to get out of the house. He teaches himself law. He becomes a prairie lawyer. He rides a horse from town to town solving disputes. And this is where the legend of the hat begins. The stovepipe hat. It wasn't just a fashion statement to make him look even taller. It was his briefcase. He stuffed legal papers, letters, banknotes, and even his lunch inside the hat. If you asked him for a document, he'd take off his hat and fish it out. He became incredibly popular because he was funny. He could tell a story that would make a jury laugh, then pivot to a logical argument that would make them cry. He was a master manipulator of human emotion. He enters politics, serves 1 term in Congress, hates it, opposes the Mexican-American War, and goes back to being a lawyer. He thinks his political career is over. He's just a tall, sad lawyer in Springfield, Illinois. But then the 1850s happen. The slavery debate explodes. The Kansas-Nebraska Act allows new territories to decide if they want slavery or not. Lincoln is furious. He believes slavery is a moral evil and shouldn't spread. He decides to get back in the ring. He challenges Stephen Douglas, the little giant, for a Senate seat. Douglas is short, loud, and races baiting. Lincoln is tall, awkward, and logical. They hold a series of debates that become legendary. Lincoln loses the Senate seat, but the transcripts of the debates are published nationwide. Suddenly, everyone knows the tall weirdo from Illinois. 1860 rolls around. The Republican Party is looking for a candidate for president. They need a moderate. Someone who hates slavery but isn't a radical abolitionist. They pick Lincoln. The election of 1860 is a 4-way mess. Lincoln wins with only about 40% of the popular vote. He doesn't get a single vote in the South. In fact, his name wasn't even on the ballot in 10 southern states. The moment he wins, the South says, "All right, we're out. It's been real, but we're taking our cotton and leaving." South Carolina secedes. Then Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. They form the Confederate States of America. Lincoln hasn't even taken office yet, and the country has already fallen apart. He has to take a train to Washington, D.C. for his inauguration, but there are credible assassination threats in Baltimore. So the giant 6'4" president-elect has to sneak through the city at night, wearing a soft wool hat and a shawl, disguised like an invalid. The press mocks him relentlessly for this. They call him a coward. He arrives in D.C., and it's a ghost town. The treasury is empty. The army has like 16,000 guys, and most of the good generals have just quit to join the South. Then Fort Sumter happens. The South fires on a federal fort. The Civil War begins. Everyone, and I mean everyone, thought this war would last 90 days. Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers for 3 months. People treated it like a tailgate party. They brought picnic baskets to the first Battle of Bull Run to watch the show. Then the shooting started, and blood went everywhere, and the Union Army panicked and ran all the way back to Washington. Lincoln realizes, oh no, this is going to be a long nightmare. For the first 2 years of the war, Lincoln's biggest problem wasn't the South, it was his own generals, specifically George McClellan. McClellan was a man who looked great on a horse. He was organized. The soldiers loved him. But he had one fatal flaw he was terrified of actually fighting. He had the slows. He would build a massive army, march it to within sight of the enemy, and then stop and ask for more reinforcements. Lincoln would send telegrams like, "Hey George, any plan to use that army, just checking." McClellan would write back insulting letters, calling Lincoln a well-meaning baboon and a gorilla. Lincoln took the insults because he needed a victory. At one point, Lincoln famously said, "If General McClellan does not want to use the army, I would like to borrow it for a time. The war is going badly. The North is losing battles. Morale is tanking. Lincoln is aging rapidly. If you look at photos of him from 1860 to 1864, he looks like he aged 20 years. His cheeks are sunken, his eyes are haunted." And then personal tragedy strikes again. His beloved son, Willie, dies of typhoid fever in the White House. Lincoln is shattered. Mary Todd goes completely insane with grief. She starts holding seances in the Red Room, inviting mediums to talk to dead Willie. Lincoln has to deal with a crumbling nation, a crazy wife, dead generals, and his own grief all at once. He realizes he needs to change the game. The war can't just be about preserving the Union. It has to be about something higher. It has to be about human freedom. He writes the Emancipation Proclamation. He waits for a victory to release it, so he doesn't look desperate. He gets a messy draw at the Battle of Antietam, and that's good enough. He drops the proclamation. Technically, it only frees slaves in the rebelling states, where he has no power, but symbolically, it changes everything. Now the Union Army is an army of liberation. This keeps Europe out of the war because Britain and France don't want to support a slave nation against a freedom nation. Then comes Gettysburg. 1863, the bloodiest battle of the war. 50,000 casualties in 3 days. Months later, they dedicate a cemetery there. The main speaker is a guy named Edward Everett. He talks for 2 hours. He recites epic Greek history. He uses big words. Then Lincoln stands up. He looks at a piece of paper. He speaks for 2 minutes. Just 2 minutes. The photographer setting up his camera didn't even have time to take the picture before Lincoln sat down. Lincoln thought he failed. He told his friend, "That speech won't scour." But the Gettysburg Address became the most famous speech in American history. 77 years ago, he redefined the war not as a political struggle, but as a test of whether democracy can survive on Earth. Finally, Lincoln finds a general who understands math. Ulysses S. Grant. Grant wasn't a fancy tactician. He was a bulldog. He knew the North had more men and more guns, so he just kept attacking. People complained to Lincoln that Grant was a drunk. Lincoln replied, "Find out what brand of whiskey he drinks and send a barrel to my other generals." With Grant attacking in Virginia and General Sherman burning down everything in Georgia, Literally, Sherman's march to the sea was basically an arson tour. The South collapses. April 9th, 1865. Robert E. Lee surrenders at Appomattox. The war is over. The Union is saved. Slavery is dead. Lincoln is the hero of the world. He walks through the streets of Richmond, the Confederate capital, and formerly enslaved people fall to their knees weeping. Lincoln tells them, "Don't kneel to me. You kneel to God only." April 14th, 1865. Good Friday. Lincoln is exhausted but happy. He tells Mary he wants to travel to Europe, maybe visit the Holy Land. He decides to go to the theater to relax. The play is a comedy called Our American Cousin. He goes to Ford's Theater. He sits in the presidential box. Now here is where the security failure happens. The police officer assigned to guard Lincoln's door was a guy named John Parker. John Parker had a history of drinking on the job. During the intermission, Parker thinks, "Hey, the president is fine," and he leaves his post to go to the saloon next door for a drink. The same saloon where the assassin is drinking. Enter John Wilkes Booth, famous actor, heartthrob, Southern sympathizer, crazy person. He knows the play by heart. He knows there is a line that makes the audience laugh loudly, which will cover the sound of a gunshot. He creeps into the box. He waits for the line, "You sock-dologizing old man trap." The audience roars with laughter. Booth steps forward, puts a Derringer pistol to the back of Lincoln's head, and pulls the trigger. Lincoln slumps forward. Booth jumps from the balcony onto the stage. But his spur gets caught in the American flag draped over the rail. He lands awkwardly and breaks his leg. He stands up, brandishes a knife, and yells, "Sic semper tyrannis." Thus always to tyrants. The audience thinks it's part of the play. They're like, "Wow, dramatic twist," until Mary Todd screams. They carry Lincoln across the street to a boarding house. He's too tall for the bed, so they have to lay him diagonally. He never wakes up. He dies the next morning at 7:22 a.m. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton looks at him and says, "Now he belongs to the ages." They put his body on a train to take him back to Springfield. The train ride takes weeks. Millions of Americans line the tracks, crying, singing, lighting bonfires. It was the biggest funeral in history. And here is the final irony. Lincoln spent his whole life thinking he was ugly, unlovable, and a failure. He died without knowing that he would become the most beloved figure in the American pantheon. He saved the country, he broke the chains, and he did it all while battling demons inside his own head. So the next time you fail a test or have a bad hair day, just remember Abe Lincoln. He failed at business, failed at love, had a face like a catcher's mitt, and still managed to become the greatest American who ever lived. Let's start with the physical stats, because they are insane. Abraham Lincoln was a mutant. In the 1800s, the average man was about 5'7". Lincoln was 6'4". He towered over everyone. He had arms that dangled down to his knees and hands the size of dinner plates. And he wasn't lanky and weak. He was ripped. Before he was a lawyer, he was a frontier wrestler. And I don't mean WWE with scripts and costumes. I mean throw a guy into a pile of manure wrestling. He participated in about 300 matches and lost only one. There is a confirmed historical account where Lincoln knocked out. His opponent looked at the crowd and yelled, "I'm the big buck of this lick if any of you want to try it. Come on, and wet your horns." That is not a quote from a Marvel movie. That is the 16th President of the United States. So if you think Lincoln was just a nerd reading books, remember that he could physically fold you like a lawn chair. But where did this giant come from? He was born in 1809 in a log cabin in Kentucky. And when I say log cabin, don't think of a cozy Airbnb. Think of a wooden box with a dirt floor, wind whistling through the cracks, and a bear probably looking in the window. It was poverty on a level we can't even comprehend. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was illiterate and kind of a grump. His mother, Nancy, was wonderful, but she died when Lincoln was just 9 years old from something called milk sickness. Basically, a cow ate a poisonous plant called white snake root. Lincoln's mom drank the milk and she died. It was a brutal way to go. This tragedy hit Lincoln hard. He became withdrawn and moody. His dad remarried a woman named Sarah Bush Johnston, who was actually awesome and encouraged Lincoln to read. And read he did. He read everything. He would walk 20 miles just to borrow a book. His dad hated this. Thomas Lincoln thought reading was for lazy people. Now let's talk about his love life, because it is a train wreck. His first true love was a woman named Anne Rutledge. She was beautiful, smart, and perfect. So naturally, because this is Lincoln's life, she died of typhoid fever. Lincoln spiraled. He was found wandering in the woods muttering to himself. He was suicidal. This was the beginning of his melancholy, what we today would call clinical depression. He battled it his entire life. But eventually, he meets Mary Todd. Oh boy, Mary Todd. She was short, plump, wealthy, and had a temper that could strip paint off a wall. She was brilliant and ambitious. She famously said she wanted to marry a man who would become president, but she was also incredibly unstable. Their marriage was volatile. There are stories of Mary smashing coffee cups over Lincoln's head, chasing him with a broomstick, and screaming at him in public. Lincoln would just sigh, pick up one of his children, and walk out of the house until she cooled down.